I'm reading The Laird and the Lady. It's a novel by Joan Marshall Grant. She wrote books about her previous incarnations, but this one is her one fictional book. It was published in 1949, and she passed away in 1989, but some of her reincarnation books are amazing. The Winged Pharaoh is one of my favorites. Anyhow, they're in my YouTube descriptions, the ones she has written. We are here in chapter 15. This is the story of Marylda and Rowan. They met at a French chateau. They're now in his Highland castle. It's called Cloud. And they've had their honeymoon, etc. We are now in chapter 15, No Ostriches. When Rowan opened the door of Georgina's sitting room, she was seated at the desk, resolutely adding a column of figures in the estate account book. Busy, Georgina? No, dear. Did Marylda sleep? Yes, and she's had breakfast. Only coffee and orange juice, but she didn't want anything else. She says she's going to be lazy this morning. I left her because I think she'll doze off again if she's alone. Georgina screwed the top on her fountain pen, glad of the small respite of this trivial efficiency, and said, Marylda wasn't delirious last night. She mightn't have been so honest without the shock and the whiskey, but it was honesty, nothing more. So you're not going to try to bluff me any longer? I hope you realize how much that means. Lying to someone you love is never easy, and it's a luxury neither of us can any longer afford. I apologize very humbly for being a fool and a coward. We are Highland. It was the act of a parvenu to pretend we could avoid the responsibilities of the sight. And there are other ways in which I have been a fool. You mean when you tried to make me marry Janet? It's not a very adequate excuse, but I thought she would be so reliable. You thought I'd rather be bored than haunted? I did. I have already admitted that I acted with a minimal intelligence. Janet was to laugh me out of my fancies? Dear Georgina, how could she, when you have failed to laugh yourself out of your own? You underrate my efforts. I read a quantity of books which varied from standard works of psychology, usually written in a phraseology which might well have been in an inept translation from the Sanskrit, to the vapourings of assorted isms which offended all canons of taste. Fortunately, I had the wit to recognize that neither school had the authority of empiricism. But I must admit that for a while I was almost convinced myself that I suffered from no more than an obsession built up from my jealousy of Emily. In some of the more massive tomes, there were heartening references to hypnotic visions, which are supposed to be due to a repressed idea, which eventually bursts out of its neat little pigeonhole and appears objective. That was the theory of a psychoanalyst whom I consulted years ago. He asked me impertinent questions and expected me to visit him frequently at an exorbitant fee. He had a wart on the side of his nose and remarkably damp hands. He patronized me, and I nearly invited him to Cloud, so that he could have a thorough haunting and be frightened out of his futile little wits. Emily would probably have ignored him, and he would have left even more complacent. Then I could have gone to Darwin and spent the night with Lady Fiona and her black goats. I'm sure Alistair would have opened the East Wing for his special benefit. This, Georgina, is definitely an occasion, said Rowan. Do you realize that for the first time we are being honest with each other? It requires a celebration, an honourable snort. For a moment, Georgina reverted to the behaviour pattern she had so laboriously constructed. It's not yet 11. Sherry and a biscuit if you wish, but not what you meant by a snort. What you mean by a snort? He laughed, and she heard him run down the cellar stairs to return with a glass jug of whisky drawn from the oldest cask. Do you want water with yours? Your grandmother maybe nearly 70, but she is not yet senile. They clinked glasses. My apologies for having been a damn fool for a considerable number of years. I was also a snob. If you had been content with seeing the old haunts, I don't think I should have minded so much. But a ghost in a straw boater, a ghost one personally disliked, it was too much. I resented Emily dead even more than I hated her when she was alive. Poor Emily, I'm afraid we have been very inhospitable. It must be bleak to continue as an unwanted guest. Ghost. I confess it did not occur to me that anyone who was not a Celt could have the sight. When Marylda became aware of Emily, I felt guilty. Like the unfortunate people who suddenly discover they are typhoid carriers. Gargle or you'll scratch my ghost? Thank God. That, at last, we can joke about. I didn't find it amusing. I tried to dislike Marylda, as though she was usurping a privilege, a Satzenach wearing our tartan. Georgina, we've got to make up our minds what causes all this. Until we've got it clear ourselves, we can't help her. Do we or do we not believe in ghosts? Do we or do we not wish to play ostriches? Said Georgina briskly. We don't. From now on, ostriches are out. But is there an alternative explanation? I've read quite a lot about it, rather naturally. The easiest theory is that strong emotion can register on the atmosphere of a place in much the same way that sound waves can be impressed on vulcanite. Certain types of people act as the needle to the gramophone disc. Alistair brought a woman here about 3 years ago. She wanted to see the skull. She was so remarkably accurate that I thought she'd got the data from Alistair and was showing off. But when it came to explaining, she only said it was psychometry, which didn't really mean anything. Alistair is convinced she's genuine. He says her findings are far too often right to be only coincidence or fake. Why shouldn't Marylda be a psychometrist without realizing it? Let's accept for a moment that ghosts are only a kind of emotional stain, beyond the range of ordinary awareness, but available to those who have a wider sensitivity. After all, dogs can register a whistle too high-pitched for the human ear to register. She shook her head. I'm afraid that won't do. I tried to psychometrize, but nothing happened. On the other hand, Alistair's female had never seen a ghost. I think that rather annoyed her. Then there must be different kinds of awareness, which don't necessarily overlap. But if Marylda sees Emily, why doesn't she even feel anything in Alice's tower? Why is Emily so much more solid than our respectable family ghost? I don't know, said Georgina reluctantly. If it comes to that, why don't I see Alice? Visitors quite often did. Before Thunder gave up putting anyone in her room, Hector and I used to be delighted when they came down to breakfast and admitted they'd had an uncomfortable night. Did they see Alice merely because she was a conventional haunt? Why, what could be more typical than a woman carrying her husband's head? They all knew the story, so she was relevant. But she wasn't relevant to you. She was just part of Cloud's tradition. But for some reason Emily is relevant to Marylda? Yes, and I don't know why. But we have got to find out. You heard her talking last night. If she only saw Emily, it wouldn't matter. But she fell off the rock because Emily fell. She nearly drowned because the weight of Emily's waders were dragging her down. I realized that, said Georgina. I remember only too well how close Emily came to being drowned. Robbie rescued her as he rescued Marylda. The only difference was that yesterday I thanked God that he came in time, and before I wept with disappointment because I thought death would have been sufficient to remove her. It was very ingenious of me. Have there been any other incidents? Certainly one, probably more, that I didn't notice. We were out for a walk after dinner. There was a full moon and we went to the water lily loch. Suddenly she said, let's swim across, and This time I won't make a fuss." There was nothing odd in wanting to swim, for it was a hot night, but I knew she hadn't been there before, so it gave me a bit of a shock when she said, "Don't you remember how nice I look swimming naked, when the brown water makes my skin look gold? And if I get caught in the lilies, I shall swim very fast instead of crying to you to rescue me." What really shook me was that she called me Hector. Emily swam with Hector there. She used to joke about it. I gather he had laughed at her for thinking the slimy stalks of the lilies were eels. "So you realize why I'm afraid. I don't suppose I'd have admitted it, even to you, unless I had a bit of whiskey inside me. Marylda is becoming a kind of mirror for Emily. What happens if she can't help reflecting her?" "You are afraid that Duncan will play the role of the chauffeur." "No," said Rowan, and found it surprising that he really meant it. "I know it sounds conceited, but I don't believe Marylda will ever want to leave me. It isn't only that Duncan is my friend and I trust my wife. It's something deeper than that. I don't believe it is part of the pattern." "She did run away," said Georgina. "She is buried in Paris. I went there to make quite sure after Hector died. A suicide, buried in a Christian cemetery with Highland gold. A donation to the church was enough to convince the authorities that she had fallen into the Seine by accident." "I thought you'd never crossed the Channel." "So does everyone. I said I was going to London to buy baby clothes for Hamish. No one knew I spent 2 nights in Paris. I wore a veil and travelled second class, both quite unnecessary and most uncomfortable. I went there because I believed that suicides stayed either in the place where they died or where they are buried, but I couldn't find Emily." "But why did you want her?" "I thought she might be able to comfort Hector. I knew he was still in Cloud, though I never saw him." "But you heard him," he said quickly. "It's Hector whom I used to hear crying. But why should he still be here when he died in a shooting accident?" "But he didn't. He hanged himself." She was surprised that her voice could sound so normal. "It happened on the evening of the day Hamish was born. Only 3 people ever knew, Robbie and I and Roderick, Duncan's uncle, who died in the Boer War. They decided that it would be better for the secret to be kept, so that Hector could be buried in a church, and Hamish would never know his father was a suicide." She paused, uncertain whether it was necessary to tell him more. "Please go on," he said gently, "unless it still hurts too much even to talk about it." "After Emily ran away, Hector was very odd. He wouldn't see any of his friends. He drank too much, even for a Highlander. I stayed in the house because he didn't seem to resent me and Mother. Mother said he couldn't be left entirely alone. Then one day, it was the 17th of April, he told me that he had received a letter from a hotel in Paris, saying that a woman who had been staying there had gone out one night and never returned. They had found his address among her papers and wanted to know whether they should communicate with the police. He went to Paris by the next train. When he came back, he told me he had identified her body in the morgue and arranged for it to be decently buried. He said that if I didn't believe him, I could go to the British cemetery and see the stone that marked her grave. In June, he asked me to marry him. He was very honest. He didn't pretend to be in love with me. He thought I would understand that it was sufficient. He must have an heir for Cloud. So how could I tell him that I would have wanted his child just as much if he had been a crofter? He was very gentle with me during that year, even when I took 3 months before I could reassure him that he had not married for nothing. Sometimes I even let myself believe that he might fall in love with me when I was the mother of his son. I was 22 and very healthy, but it took 23 hours for Hamish to be born. Hector came into the room after the doctor had gone. He stood at the foot of the bed. There was one of these glasses in his hand, and the nurse, with being sentimental, had put the baby beside me. I knew how Emily would have looked, her hair loose on the pillow and her breasts very white through the lace. My hair had been plaited by the nurse in 2 red pigtails, which strained back from my high forehead. Mother had sent me a cream flannel nightdress that buttoned close to the neck. The doctor had smeared Vaseline on my nose and mouth before he gave me a little chloroform, and no one had remembered to wipe it off. Hector kissed me on the forehead. I wanted to throw my arms around his neck, but I learned to contain any demonstration of affection. Then he dipped his finger in the whiskey and made the sign of the cross on the baby's mouth. "If you see anything which your intellect denies, never admit it, my son," he said. Then he went out of the room and the nurse came to take the baby away. Very small and red he looked against her starched apron. She told me I cried because I was tired. She gave me a cup of tea and 2 pink tablets. She said that would make me sleep. I stayed awake in case Hector came back. He sometimes slept in my room when he was afraid. But Hector never admitted to fear unless he was very drunk, and that was seldom, for 2 bottles a day couldn't make him sway on his feet. I heard him in the room above, the room where everything which belonged to Emily was taken the day after she ran away. He kept the key in his safe and had the stairs bricked up after he found me trying to get in by the other door. He never found out that I could go there by climbing over the roof to the battlement walk. The same key fitted the outer door of both towers. He used to put flowers in her room, and sometimes I would find her clothes laid out on the bed as though she was just coming up to change for dinner. When I heard him up there, I used to make sure there was a full bottle of whiskey in his study. There was nothing else I could do. I thought he had only gone to tell her that his son, who should have been her own, was born. When I heard the thud of the rocking horse, I was afraid he had fallen and perhaps hurt himself. I tried to get out of bed, but the nurse came back. She said I was hysterical and gave me an injection that forced me into sleep. I let her do it because I knew Hector would never forgive me if I betrayed his secret. I thought the creaking sound was only the door of the wardrobe swaying in the wind. It was not until 3 days later that I knew it was the rope rubbing against the iron ring in the beam above the overturned rocking horse, the rope he had used to hang himself. Until the day of the funeral, I made myself believe the story they told me, that he had forgotten to unload his gun while climbing over the wall between the birchwood and the moor, and that his face was shattered. They said it, the 2 care-trees who guarded his secret, so that no one would insist on seeing him. It was Robbie who gave me the truth. He knew I could not be consoled by lies. Robbie knows Hector and Emily are still in Cloud, that she cannot be kept away by the weight of a foreign stone, or he find rest under the aisle of the church his great-grandfather built. But even with Robbie, I have kept my silence. My father was a real accident? Oh yes, I never had to lie about Hamish. The front tire of the car burst when he was fetching the doctor for your mother. I think both you and Hamish being born on the day your fathers died made me afraid of coincidences. We are not a very lucky family. You mustn't say that, she said vehemently. We are free to choose our destiny. It is wicked to become only an echo. You and Marylda are going to make a new pattern. We might be really original and have a daughter instead of a son. He saw the question in Georgina's eyes. No, not yet. I thought we ought to wait until she is less nervy. You mean until we can get rid of Emily? We've got to. Oh God, Georgina, how are we going to persuade her to go away? How are we going to bring peace to her and Hector? That was the end of chapter 15. The chapter 16 is entitled Mountain Pate. Or Pate? No, Mountain Pate.